Yeah, everyone, thanks for joining us for today's Sihasin Hour. This is part of our special series relating to helium development on Navajo Nation. And we are joined today by James McClure, the CEO of Navajo Nation Oil and Gas Company. We're glad that you're here with us, James. We're looking forward to your presentation. As folks know, we had a panel on this proposed development project in February, and we wanted to kind of dive into the issues a little bit more. There were lots of questions and discussion, and so we've held a few different series or a few different sessions in this series, and we wanted to include NOG to give a little more information on the nuts and bolts, essentially, of the development projects and a little more context as well. So thank you, James, for being available. I know you have a PowerPoint presentation. So James, as I mentioned, is the CEO of NOG, and he comes to NOG with an extensive background in oil and gas development that he'll share a little bit more about, I think, in his presentation. You all know me, Executive Director for Yeha Alnido, which does business as Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. Ethel Branch and Chef, Biputwani Nishlan, Nakai Bashchin, Sitnajani Dashache, Do Nakai Dashanala. And we're happy to have you here with us today. James, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you and to do just a brief introduction, and then you can go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel, and Yatahe Navajo Nation. Really glad to be with everyone this morning, or actually afternoon now. Mihail, you're going to put the presentation up now. I can start to walk through. So as Ethel said, my name is James McClure. I am the CEO of Navajo Nation Oil and Gas. I've got a bio slide that I'll probably just go through right now. That talks about, and you can just go to slide number 3 real quick, Neil. So I began this role in May of 2019. I had worked I've got over 35 years of experience in the oil and gas sector, and the last 15 years before I joined NOG was overseas. I worked internationally in Indonesia. I lived in London and managed businesses in North Africa, in the Middle East, and in Central Europe. And my wife and I and 2 children lived there. My family moved back to the U.S. in 2018, and I was approached by this role by the Navajo Nation Oil and Gas Board of Directors to step in as the CEO. With the intent of trying to grow the company. My parents and I grew up in an area south of Dallas. My wife and I currently live in Bryan, Texas, which is a kind of a sister city to College Station, Texas, which is where Texas A&M is located, and that's where my wife works. And my 2 children are grown and both have gone off to university. My daughter lives and works in Nashville in the entertainment industry, and my son works in wealth management out in Los Angeles. And I do travel quite often to the Navajo Nation. Our office is in St. Michael's, Arizona, near Window Rock, and I tend to be out there every other week for sure. I'm actually traveling out tomorrow to be out on the Nation. Previous slide, please. First off, I thought it'd be important just to start with who is NOG. There's been a lot of conversation about that over the last few months. We are an entity of the Navajo Nation. We're not an outside firm. We were established in 1993 with the intent of starting convenience stores at that time. Over its life, the company has invested in oil and gas production assets, primarily the Anath oil field in southern Utah. The nation did provide some investment over its life. As I understand from just my research, around $15 million was invested by the nation. And that started, again, with the investment around convenience store support, and then a small amount when NOG purchase interest in the Aneth oil field. The company and its partners, through its oil and gas production and its convenience store support, provides royalties to the Navajo Nation, royalties and pseudo tax that we provide to the central government. And those royalties exceed $75 million a year annually. That would indicate about $500 million that NOG has provided to the Navajo Nation over the last 7 years. You can go back in time; it's well over $1 billion in contributions that we and our partners provide to the Navajo Nation for use in public funding. Our businesses are focused in what we call the upstream, which is the oil and gas production assets. Midstream, which is a pipeline business called Running Horse Pipeline, where we move crude oil from the Aneth oil field area to New Mexico, where it then moves into different pipeline networks, ultimately approaching refineries. And then the final segment's our downstream segment, which is really the face of Navajo Nation Oil and Gas, our convenience stores. We currently have 6 convenience stores, and we're looking for opportunities to grow in that sector. The majority of our staff is Navajo, again, headquarters in St. Michael's. We have a 7-person board. The majority of that board is Navajo. And we have 5 shareholder representatives that provide oversight from the Navajo Nation Council. There's been a lot of discussion about what our shareholder reps. They represent each of the 5 standing committees of the Navajo Nation Council. And their role is we tend to have quarterly meetings with the shareholder reps to ensure business performance, business strategy, that they are in alignment with our board and with our management. And so we do meet with them on a periodic basis. The company is in excellent financial health. I was asked to join after a period of when NOG had really struggled financially and had some governance issues back in the 2015-16 time period. The company did approach the Navajo Nation for a loan at that point. Ultimately, the Navajo Nation decided that it was not interested, and the company was able to secure financing from a bank group in New York called Guggenheim. And then recently, in late 2020, we were able to refinance our loan with a company called Transpancos Bank in San Antonio, Texas. And that has really, the company's in just some fantastic financial health. A lot of decisions we can get into later about why the company struggled back in the 2015 to 16 time period. But decisions that we take now, and I know as a leader of this organization, my priority is ensuring that we've got an entity that's financially strong and can benefit the Navajo Nation and its people, and that we don't return to any of the past decisions that put the company in financial constraints. Slide number 4, please. So this talk today, I've got a number of slides. I'm going to try to go through them fairly quick because of just our time limit. This is highly, technical at times, and it's focused on helium development. And so I'm trying to give you a sense of why we feel like this is an investment opportunity that the Navajo Nation should support. Helium is in short supply, and that is causing a disconnect between demand and supply, which ultimately yields an elevated price. So to be able to sell helium into the marketplace is very attractive right now. When you couple that with the Navajo Nation being blessed with large quantities of helium, it makes for a business opportunity. We're an entity that's charged with developing the oil and gas resources of the Navajo Nation. And we have put forth this proposal to the council to develop. It is helium is an odorless, non-toxic, non-flammable gas, colorless, lighter than air. We breathe helium in every breath that we take on Earth. It's designated as a critical mineral. It's got a lot of humanitarian benefits with respect to medical industry. Every MRI machine in the world has to use helium with respect to coolants on their magnets. Also, semiconductor industry uses helium to ensure a safe work environment or a clean work environment. Also, it's used in aerospace. Every flight out to outer space these days uses helium. So the demand of helium, I think most people think about party balloons, but the real demand growth tends to be in these industries, and supply is a problem. There's the supply chain for helium is mostly focused outside of the US right now, at least the growth areas, in areas like Russia and the Middle East. Where there are resources or deposits in the United States, there is a push these days to try to develop that. Next slide. There we go. So this is for those who want to get real technical. This goes back to our chemistry days of school, and the periodic table. And helium is an inert gas, element number 2. And because of this, it doesn't have the ability to react. So if you were to have a full container of helium, it's non-flammable. It's not going to react with anything. It's just, it is its own inert element. And there are other inert elements that are in the atmosphere. Next slide. How is helium formed? Well, it is formed in the depths and core of the Earth. And it is a degradation of uranium and thorium at miles below the surface of the Earth. It is a gas in a gaseous state, and it moves from the core of the Earth up through the crust and ultimately makes its way to the surface of the Earth, where it emits, it's constantly emitting from our Earth. However, there are geologic structural traps that occur where we may be able to find helium deposits that approach economic quantities in that sense. The past discoveries of helium on the Navajo Nation and really in the world have been associated with oil and gas exploration. And there are currently companies that operate on the Navajo Nation that produce helium. What NOG is attempting to do is much different. And I think this is where a lot of misinformation has been out about what our effort is focused on. We're trying to discover helium in its purest form. And normally what we're attempting to do is find that associated with other gases that are not carbon chain gases. So those could be nitrogen is one aspect. Now, I'm sure there are questions about is there risk or is there the potential that we might find other carbons, other fossil fuels, and there is. We're not certain yet, and that's where exploration in our business, until we drill wells and produce that gas to the surface, we're not absolutely certain what we're going to find. We just have a probable case, and that probable case today is a large percentage of nitrogen and a large percentage of helium. We conduct a lot of different exploration techniques to ultimately find helium, and I'll talk about those further in the presentation. Next slide. The key points that helium is not a fossil fuel. It's, as I said, constantly emitting. We're looking at deposits on the Navajo Nation that approach 8 to 10% of the full gas. This other associated gas we expect are going to be nitrogen. And these deposits, when you compare them to large oil fields, for instance, like the Aneth oil field, they tend to be much smaller. So the impact of the life of this production is going to be short-lived. Still could be 10 years, but not like you see with the Aneth oil field. The Aneth oil field was discovered in the 50s, and we expect it to last until 2050. So potentially a 100-year-old oil field there. It's a large discovery. Most of these helium deposits are going to be much smaller. Next slide. So I thought it'd be worthwhile to just talk a bit about the process for how we actually are given the opportunity to actually explore for helium on the Navajo Nation. We negotiate operating agreements, and we did that with the Minerals Department, which is part of the executive branch, and the Department of Justice. Once we finalize those negotiations, it goes through a process with the Navajo Nation Council and then the executive branch on to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There are reviews that occur about these leases to ensure that we identify sacred sites, environmental risk, the different departments of the Natural Resources Group of the executive branch of the government help identify those items for us. And so when we then move to the activity stage, which is on the right side of this slide, we have to ultimately acquire permits. And those permits are going to be reviewed and approved by various agencies, whether that's the Department or the Division of Natural Resources, the Bureau of Land Management, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Before they sign off, we have to provide a strategy or a plan, or how we're not going to have negative impacts, whether that's impacts on residents, sacred sites, or environmental impacts. We have to describe how we're going to mitigate all those risks before we're ever allowed to implement work. Next slide. As I said, we finalized all our negotiations. Unfortunately, this started back in the fourth quarter of 2019 when we started the initial conversations. COVID definitely delayed the progress of these agreements. The Minerals Department and Navajo Nation DOJ, we were able to finalize the agreements in the third quarter of 2021. So next slide. And then we've now moved, as I said, into the discussions with the council. There are 3 agreements that we are ultimately seeking approval on. The first is one we call Tohatchee Wash, that's in the Tisnaspas chapter. And then there are 2 others currently called Beautiful Mountain, and the other is called Porcupine Dome. Those are in the Sanasti chapter. We have talked to the chapter about changing the name of the Beautiful Mountain Agreement. There was some concern that maybe we were going to do work on top of Beautiful Mountain, and that is not the case. We're well to the east of that, but we named it Beautiful Mountain just because of the proximity. Our intent is to change that name. Unfortunately, this slide says during the winter session, but it's ultimately going to have to be the spring session now. Okay, next slide. This is just a high-level map of where our operations at. This slide and the next slide. So this is where the Aneth oil field sits in the Four Corners region. We've got 2 other small oil fields right to the south and west of the Aneth field that NOG operates. We have a pipeline that runs from Aneth into New Mexico. And then ultimately, the next slide highlights the helium opportunity. So next slide, please. This is just a deep dive on the Four Corners region of where these 3 operating agreements sit. So the Tohatchee Wash sits in the Tisnaspas chapter in northeast Arizona, and then the Beautiful Mountain and Porcupine Dome areas are in the Sanasti chapter south of Shiprock. Next slide, please. The details of the operating agreements, it provides rights to both NOG and the Navajo Nation. There's a primary term of exploration where we're able to go out and really search for helium to produce. That's a 10-year term. And then there's a secondary term where we produce that helium as long as there's paying quantities. So if, let's say, for instance, in the first year we discover helium, we would draw a box around that little area, and we would move from the primary to the secondary term so that we could start production. Once production begins, well, actually before we have production, when we sign these agreements, NOG is required to pay a bonus up front to the Navajo Nation. We pay rentals for the land, again, to the Navajo Nation central government. If we have production, we will pay royalties. We will pay a tax. We call it a payment in lieu of tax, or a PILT, since NOG is an entity of the nation and doesn't pay taxes. And then finally, we pay scholarships. So those are all laid out in the formal agreement. As I said earlier, we must obtain permits to be able to actually implement our work. And we must protect water resources. And I've got a slide later that will talk, that'll highlight that. And we have to have sufficient insurance to be able to cover all of our operations. Next slide. This is just a high-level slide of all the different reviews that occur within the Navajo Nation, within the Bureau of Land Management, so forth. So you can see there's a review around air, around cultural aspects, environmental justice, waste, land, noise, wildlife and fisheries, so on and so forth. So there's a significant amount of review. These organizations, they're part of the central government of the Navajo Nation, and they provide the oversight to operators like NOG to ensure we do things safely and environmentally in an environmentally conscious and next slide. If we're successful, this is some of the benefit that will then go to move to the Navajo Nation. So we upfront will pay a little over $750,000 million to the nation on bonuses. There will be an upfront the amount of $30,000 in scholarships that is paid initially. Those scholarships can grow if we're successful. We pay a royalty to the nation of 20% and 5% in tax. So 25% of our production, our revenue stream, goes to the central government. I put in here that those are very competitive. When you compare that percentage to other agreements off the Navajo Nation, NOG recently signed agreements in the state of Arizona to develop helium, and the royalty rates are half of this. So, you know, the Navajo Nation actually, they've got a very good terms with respect to exploration when you compare that to other areas around the United States. There will be sales taxes that also come out of the work. So when we procure a drilling rig or any type of service, we'll have to pay tax. There will be taxes paid to the nation for that. What's important to understand is that we are talking about 3 operating agreements today with the Navajo Nation Council, but there are potentially 40 opportunities that we currently have identified, and we feel like we're going to probably identify much more. If those 40 were successful, this is a potential billion-dollar business for the nation, for their share. And so we see it as when the nation is looking for new revenue opportunities, this is one that we think they should consider. Next slide. So just to transition now to some of the benefits and some of the impacts that happen at the chapter level. Benefits, we believe there will be jobs, there will be contract labor jobs, there will be field labor jobs. We have also communicated that we would take some of our profit and share that with the local community. We hear the chapter officials and community members when they say that monies that flow to the central government don't always flow to the chapter. And I am very empathetic to that plea. And so we have indicated, and our board supports us paying a share of our profit to the local chapter to hopefully help them with any projects that they may see as beneficial. And then finally, we see this as somewhat an opportunity that NOG will be a partner with the community. We're not an outside entity. Even though I'm not Navajo, you know, I run a Navajo business, and it's really important for us to have shared values, ultimately that we listen to concerns and we address whatever issues are out there within the community as we try to operate going forward. Next slide. So what to expect? Well, we do have certain types of activities that help us to identify, is there helium deposits there or not. The first type of activity is that we conduct Seismic surveys, we conduct aeromag surveys. That tends to be a plane that flies over the earth to try to measure its magnetic field. So it allows us to build geologic models. We also then would move into drilling phase. Once we drill, we would install what we call a Christmas tree. It's a series of valves that will hold the gas under pressure so that it doesn't escape into the atmosphere, because if it escapes, you lose your economic benefit. And then depending on the development scenario, and it's unique for each area, we could have to install a processing facility and then transport the helium to market through trucks. So that tends to be what you might expect at the kind of a physical impact at each community. Next slide. So let's just talk about each of those. Seismic activity. Our intent is to use what we call vibrisized seismic as often as possible. It's somewhat hard to show on this slide, but the middle of the truck, there's a pad that actually moves down to the earth, and it just thumps the earth. And that thump creates a seismic wave that we can measure. If you see the photos on the far right, that's all the computer systems that allow us to monitor the seismic, wave that moves through the earth, so we ultimately can draw and create geologic pictures. And I won't bore all the audience on how we do that, but our technical team is very experienced on being able to create geologic models out of this seismic activity. Next slide. I mentioned aeromag. So we have, over this region, we have flown a plane. It has a monitor which simply measures the magnetic field of the earth, and it just flies back and forth. And other than being noisy for a couple of days, there's no other impact. That again allows us, if you go back to the slide, you don't have to move it, Mihio, but if you were to look at the slide previously that had the red lines, those are projected faults in the earth that we're measuring using this type of technology. So it allows us to really draw a geologic picture, enhanced picture, coupled with our seismic. Next slide. This is a visual of the type of output that we get. So the United States Geologic Survey has done pretty much over the entirety of the United States, has flown aeromag surveys before, and they've done it on a very coarse grid. 3 miles by 9 miles is what you see on the left. Whenever you start to consider oil and gas activity and you want to use aeromag as a tool, you'll fly much lower density. So in this case, we flew 1/4 mile by 1 mile spacing, and you can see the clarity of definition that you can obtain. And this again is trying to map subsurface elements that could be traps for helium. So this is some of the technical aspects that we utilize to ultimately determine. And the good thing is this has minimal impact. We fly an airplane to be able to determine this. Next slide.
James, on that slide that you just had up,
yes,
which color shows potential resource helium?
Yeah, great question. It will not highlight the helium. What it does is it highlights the geologic features. So the red that you see is actually something that is closer to the surface of the earth. And as you get deeper in the sediments, that's when it moves to green and to blue. So what we look for in our exploration activity is to try to target structures. So the red structures tend to be in a subsurface sense. You got to just visualize this as below the surface of the earth. We're looking for thick structures that potentially could hold helium. So that's I know that's not probably the best explanation, but you won't be able to see helium per se with this type of survey. You just will see geologic structures. That is the risk of our business, is that, you know, there's a high probability that we will drill wells and we will not find helium. There is a probability of that. What we try to do is to mitigate as much risk as possible, whether that's through aeromag or through seismic or the next technique that I'm going to share here in a bit. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. So the next technique is soil sampling. So we take we have a tool where we bore into the earth. We do not take any of the earth. All we do is just drill a bore into it a few feet, and we measure. We literally sniff the earth, and we're trying to measure the content of helium. As I said earlier, helium is constantly emitting from the earth. So you have a small percentage, you know, less than 1/4% that's coming out of the earth constantly. What we're trying to find is areas of anomaly. If you find that in this area where you might have elevated helium, you might be able to measure as high as 1 or 2%. Again, that's not necessarily economic, but it could indicate that you have a helium structure, have a structure that has large amounts of helium that we could ultimately then explore for. So those three techniques are tools that we're currently using to try to identify where there could be helium. Next slide. I was asked to kind of show what's the impact of drilling. So one of the pieces I think of confusion with this legislation is a belief that the areas of the operating agreements, that we would destroy the earth in all of that polygon area. And that's simply not the case. What we look for and we create is what we call a drilling pad. So they tend to be smaller than a football field. And we move in a drilling location. We do have to create a kind of a gravel structure to be able to put the drilling rig on. And so there'll be an operation for a few weeks where we drill a well, and then we move the drilling rig off. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just a picture of kind of the size of the rig. And so our intent is to have a very small footprint and ultimately less surface disturbance. There's been questions about, hey, well, if you're close to a residence, what is how do you compensate the impacted individuals or families? So there is a process with the Navajo Nation Land Department that companies like NOG are required to compensate those impacted. So we would look at where the ideal location is for the well. And when I say ideal, you're talking about where you could drill a vertical well, a well straight down. It tends to be a size of a hole that may be as big as 10 inches, that we drill down to a depth of the target. And in this case, we're looking at, maybe as deep as 5,000 or 6,000 feet below the surface of the earth. And that, once we're completed, then we'll put a series of valves at the surface. So next slide. Well, let me, before I get to the next slide, let me just talk about, as we're drilling, one of the key aspects of our activity is to protect fresh water. This is something our industry does routinely throughout the world. That's not to say there haven't been issues. There have been issues, and we tend to attribute that to operators who are not engineering their wells properly. I've got a technical team that's got similar to me, 30 to 35 years of experience, who've done this around the globe. And what our intent is that you drill a hole, and then you run pipe inside of that hole, and then you pump cement between the hole, the hole that's drilled and the pipe. And that annulus, we call it, ultimately is filled with cement, and that prevents any any contaminants that could potentially move into a freshwater sand. So that is something that's kind of routinely done in our industry. We run what we call cement bond logs, that's on the bottom left, to ultimately ensure that we've got proper cement that provides a barrier for those freshwater areas, freshwater sands in the wellbore. Now, freshwater tends to be in the shallower depths of the well. So usually in the first 500 feet is when you're going to potentially see freshwater. And so there's a lot of care that's taken by our industry to ensure that we do not pollute. That is, it's kind of paramount in our activity. Next slide. And then if we're successful and we put production facilities in place, we install barriers to ensure that there will be no flow of any liquids or so forth that ultimately goes out of our barrier. Now, some may ask, well, if you're not going to make hydrocarbons, why do you need that barrier? Well, most production of any resource that is 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 feet below the surface of the earth, you have to remember that gas, it is under a certain pressure and temperature at that depth. And as it comes to the surface, it starts to form condensation, which tends to be salty. So you will normally have salt water that comes to the surface. You have to separate that from your gas to be able to process the gas properly. Then you're able to take that salt water and dispose of it in various locations around the United States. There's what they call saltwater disposal wells. So it's our intent, any kind of production facility we have, we provide barriers so that there will not be any type of saltwater spills that occur. Next slide. So as I said, after we drill a well, and if we're successful, we'll put in place a series of valves. We call it a Christmas tree. Now, this well here, this is the Z well location, which is on the within the Proposed chapter, currently exists. And this well has tested high concentrations of helium. And it was drilled a number of years ago, I think back in the 1960s, well before NOG was even in existence. NOG, through the Navajo Nation, is working to take this well over and actually develop helium here. But these types of valves or Christmas trees ultimately provides a barrier so that the gas will not go into the atmosphere. Next slide. Also, what we try to do is also understand from an impact standpoint, how do we ultimately return our operation back to its original state. So NOG has been on a campaign here since I took over and formed a new technical team of going to our operations and looking at where there is no future economic utility, and ultimately plug and abandon, that's what the P&A stands for, plug and abandon the wells and to clean up the surface. And so what you're seeing on the left is the old operation, and on the right is the new. Now, these tend to be oil operations up in our Utah area, but this would be the same type of effort that we would make for any helium development that we might make, is ultimately returning our operation to the original state. That's something we see as a value and should be done routinely. We just completed a program where we addressed 19 wells of a similar nature. Next slide. There was a question that I received about how many wells will you drill? Well, this is an example from the Tohatchee Wash, again, Proposed chapter. The Z well that you see on the lower right is an existing well. And this is a geologic map, kind of, I won't get into the details of that, but just talks about the geologic structure, elevations or so forth. So we definitely have a well already there. And then potentially we see other structures in this area. And this has been identified through this work around seismic that we have, historical seismic and soil sampling, that we've identified already 2 potential structures that we could drill. Within those structures, they're larger than what you see at the Z well structure. So it's possible we may drill 2 wells in each of those. And we might find other structures when we start shooting additional seismic. But our anticipation is 5 to 10 wells in this region of Tisnas, similar for Beautiful Mountain, similar for Porcupine Dome. That tends to be our current view. Again, exploration it yields information, and the information will allow us to make decisions as we move forward with the operation of whether we should drill more wells or not. It ultimately is going to be an economic driven decision. Next slide. I'm really getting down to the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to talk a bit about the benefits for these 3 opportunities. First is this Tohatchee Wash operating agreement, again, in Tisnas. NOG invests the capital. So the capital comes out of our bank. We have to work with our bankers, but ultimately out of our annual revenues, we pay for the investment. So we have to pay for the capital cost, which is the cost to drill and put in facilities. We have to operate that. So that, in this case, you're looking at almost $30 million of investment. And that yields about $15 million for the central government and about $300,000 for the local chapter. Can we go to the next slide? And that's the bigger opportunity, which is the Sanasti revenues. This is a much larger development and a bit more complicated when it comes to production. I didn't mention earlier, one of the questions around environmental impact at Tisnas, there is an existing pipeline that allows NOG to take our helium and any other gas to a plant in Utah, in Moab, Utah, called Lisbon. When you move further south, it gets more complicated. There's currently no infrastructure in place, so you have to install a helium processing facility. I saw online a comment that we were going to install a facility on top of a sacred site. We would never do that. That's not true. We would definitely identify where those sites are and ensure that our facility was well away from any impacted site or impacted homestead. That's ultimately being a good partner. For Sanasti, you're looking at a larger investment, almost approaching $200 million of investment here. It yields bigger revenues, so approaches about $100 million, and the profit share for the chapter is between $1.5 and $2 million. So in total, you're talking benefits to the Navajo Nation for these 3 operating agreements to exceed about $120 to $125 million in potential benefit. And as I said earlier, this is just 3 of the 40 that we have identified. So if we're successful, this is a potential $1 billion business for the Navajo Nation. Next slide. So in closing, I just would say, I want to thank you for the opportunity today to highlight what our intents are. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I covered a lot of material in a short amount of time, but I'm open to trying to answer any questions that you or any of the listeners might have. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, James. That was really helpful to get all that information. So you mentioned that there are actually 40 sites that you guys are looking as possible development opportunities. Are those all sort of along that Chusca Range area, or is it in other regions of the Navajo Nation as well?
Well, what we've identified to date, I'm looking, just give me a second here. I was going to look through this presentation to see, if you recall, one of the maps that I highlighted, it showed, if you go back to slide 20 of the presentation, there was that was the map you asked the question about the colors and so forth.
All right.
And on that map is a small cutout of the Four Corners region. And it has a little small stamp inside of it that is the area that we have done the AeroMag survey on. So that's on the far left. That small area has yielded 40 prospects. So this is a world-class opportunity potentially, and I always say that word potentially, because I've been in this business long enough to know that exploration has its risk when it comes to the subsurface. We don't know yet until we actually start to drill and be able to find helium deposits about how prolific they are. But that little small area has yielded 40 prospects. We anticipate, if we're given the opportunity to continue to explore on other areas of the nation, that this could be a much bigger portfolio than just 40. You may be aware that there already is exploration activity happening to the south of the Navajo Nation. It's an area right south of I-40. It's called the Holbrook Basin. And there's been a significant amount of work down there that has yielded some success. So you can imagine that if we know we have helium in this area, in the Four Corners area, we know we have helium south of the Navajo Nation. It is, you can speculate that helium probably runs along this border between Arizona and New Mexico. When you start to move too far to the west, there are geologic limitations that probably will prevent helium from being trapped. And the same thing when you move to the east. So it's not going to be everywhere. That's maybe a misnomer, but we do think that there is the potential for further helium further south of this area that we've already done this survey on.
So when you were talking about how helium is formed, in terms of, I forget what the terminology was, but
Degradation.
Degradation,
Right.
degraded uranium. So, I mean, there's a lot of uranium opportunities on the Navajo Nation. And I'm just wondering, could we just expect that the helium opportunities kind of track the sites? Because the sites that you guys, that you have on that map there and that are proposed in these agreements, those are definitely, you know, uranium rich areas as well.
Right. Yeah, so this is you know, there's a lot of history around uranium mining on the Navajo Nation, and it's I think you have to separate the two, because what we're talking about is uranium that is in the subsurface miles deep, and so you're under a lot different pressure and temperature regimes, and the degrading of that element in the depths of the earth is what forms helium, as opposed to uranium that's at the surface. It has more of it is a uranium element, right? It's a lot different elemental structure. When helium is just degrading from uranium and thorium at depths in the earth, but when it gets to the surface, it's no longer, it's its own unique element at that point. It's then helium. So that is, I think, when I've seen some of the concerns about our activity linked to uranium, is that there's a view that, well, we can't support uranium mining again. And it's nothing of that nature. We don't mine, we don't surface mine. That's not what we do. We drill wells. And unfortunately, you know, describing how that works is not easy. I would suggest to your listeners that there are a number of YouTube videos that do describe how a well is drilled and how it's cased, and those are actually good cartoons to look at to get a better understanding of how we drill. But that linkage between uranium mining and our activity for helium is really night and day. Totally different. The helium is just a byproduct of the uranium at depth. Once in geologic time, some of that uranium is at the surface, and it's a totally different element when it's at the surface. It is uranium at that point.
Yeah. If there are particular YouTube videos that you think are really insightful for the development that would take place at these 3 sites, we're happy to post those in the chat.
Okay.
You can email those to us and we'll put them on the chat.
Definitely. I'm just going to tell you that, well, unfortunately, we had over the last week, we've had an attempt to hack our website. And so our website has actually been down for a few days. But once we're actually moving to a new host. And when we get that up and running, we will have a video on our host site that people can access. And I'll also provide you a few links to some other videos that might be worthwhile.
And then on the Christmas trees, so in the first example that you showed us, it kind of looked like the towers you might see, I don't know, in the city where they look like trees, they're disguised to look like trees.
Right.
I don't know what kind of towers those are.
Yeah. So, well,
Yeah,
this picture here is an old, very old well, and actually the Christmas tree. It's somewhat hard to describe this, but this is the amount of casing that's in the well. So when the well is deeper, the Christmas tree gets taller, is maybe the best way to describe it. It tends to be at its highest, you might see in some places in the world, if you were to go offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, you might find Christmas trees that are over 10 to 15 foot tall. This Christmas tree, on the other hand, is probably less than 4 feet. And so our Christmas trees will probably be in that 4 to 8 foot range. And again, what it is a series of valves that allows for any gas to be contained under pressure so that it cannot escape to the atmosphere. So yeah, so I know that it's not the easiest thing on this picture to describe, but it's not, and it can be. Most likely in our case, we're going to be putting everything behind a fence so that we can not have any impacts to livestock. And unfortunately, that site, we don't own that site yet. That's still owned by the Navajo Nation. We did do a partnered project with them to test helium in that well back in 2015. But these agreements are what gives us access rights. And once we get access, we're going to operate the right way. I'm very passionate about how I operate our facilities. My team is as well. We will make sure that we operate things in a manner that people can be proud of. And as opposed to doing things the wrong way. And there are operators out there who do things the wrong way. We're not one of those, and we won't be one of those. That's not the way we're going to operate.
And then these have been referred to as helium operating agreements, but the agreement is actually for any kind of oil and gas, essentially, right?
Correct.
I'm just curious why they're being described as helium agreement. Is that sort of like the target?
Correct. Yeah. So as I stated earlier, until, we always use a term, until we put a drill bit in the ground, we really aren't certain. There is a probability of finding some hydrocarbons. The probability of finding oil here is very low. And it's because of just our understanding of all the surrounding areas would indicate that finding oil is a very low probability. I mean, less than 2%. But that 2% means that you must, in your agreement, if we were to find oil, we have to have a way to develop the oil. So that's why the agreement gives that right. The reason that this has been focused to in the conversation to helium is all of our activity, all of the surrounding activity around this field these opportunities would indicate that we're going to find gas. Now, what is the gas? Most likely, you're going to find helium with some other gas, whether that's nitrogen. You could find a small amount of carbon dioxide. You could find some methane. If there's methane found, that's a carbon, right? I mean, that's a carbon fuel, that's a fossil fuel. We'll want to deal with that. How do you deal with that? Well, in the Proposed chapter, it's very simple. We'll put the gas into a pipeline and it'll go in pipeline all the way to the Lisbon gas plant and be processed in southern Utah and there will be no environmental impact at all. That's the positive thing about having a pipeline in place. When you move further south, it gets more complicated. That's where you have to put in a processing plant, and you have to separate the helium from the other gases. The helium can go to market. If it's nitrogen, we breathe nitrogen. You can vent nitrogen to the atmosphere, and there's no environmental impact. That's what we breathe, predominance of what we breathe. If it's CO2, you look for some kind of sequestration. So there are tools that allow us to sequester CO2 so there not be a major impact to the environment. And if there's methane, then you have a choice. If there is a natural gas pipeline in the region, then you try to run that methane through pipeline to that ultimate sales line so that you can market and sell your natural gas. Think of it like propane is the next step up on the hydrocarbon chain from methane. So methane, butane, propane, so forth. However, if you don't have a pipeline in the area, that's where things get more complicated. The downside, kind of the worst case scenario, is flaring. We're not a fan of flaring. There are tools called incineration, which allows you to ultimately burn off the gas and not have as significant of an impact. You've probably read recently of some Bitcoin mining. That's another process of using the power generation techniques that link to methane to be able to run generators that ultimately help you mine Bitcoin. That's another technique that's being used. What we'll have to assess all of this. I mean, our goal is to have as minimal of an impact as possible, and to be very transparent with the community if we do find amounts of methane. So, for instance, at the Z well, the Tisnaspas discovery, it has over 15% methane. And again, as I mentioned, we've got a pipeline nearby, so we can take that methane and put it into the gas pipeline along with the helium, sell it into the Lisbon gas plant, and see the financial benefit. At Sanasti, we're not sure yet. We don't have enough information to know if we're going to find methane or not. If we do, we'll have to put plans in place to mitigate any impact. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that was helpful. And then, so the operating agreement mentions seismic surveys. What is that like? What would that look like to pursue? I mean, I'm assuming that is part of the exploration process and would probably be necessary.
Right.
What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's been seismic surveys conducted around the Navajo Nation for years. Actually, NOG conducted one up in the Aneth area in September, October of 2019. What you typically will do is use that equipment that was in my presentation. It's called a vibrosizer. You'll lay out phones to be able to measure the seismic response. You have a thumper that actually creates a seismic or a sound wave, and ultimately you measure. The impact on seismic is actually very limited. There's it's very limited impact other than trucks running on the earth to be able to measure the activity. When we get closer to doing seismic, we want to sit down with the community and really explain what the impacts are.
And then what about the geophysical surveys?
So that is the same. Yeah. So seismic surveys are the same thing as geophysics. Ultimately, you're trying to, through the physics of the earth, you're trying to form or create a subsurface picture in a three-dimensional sense. So what the seismic allows you to do is it creates it allows you to create a model of the subsurface that then, as an engineer, I'm an engineer by background, you're allowed to, it gives me the information I then need to be able to target a subsurface area, which could have helium deposits, to be able to drill a well and ultimately produce it to the surface.
One thing that I noticed, and you mentioned that there's probably not going to be oil produced at these sites, but I noticed that the Navajo Nation has a royalty in kind provision that they can, or an option that they can exercise to receive their royalty in the form of oil. I thought that was interesting. Does the nation have they exercised that option in other agreements? And what would they do with,
Yes.
I assume it
Yes.
would be crude oil.
Right. It is crude oil. And yes, they currently do take their royalties in kind. And so what that allows them to do is to actually, and we facilitate that, NOG facilitates that for the nation currently with the buyer of our crude oil, which is Marathon Petroleum. So we're able to negotiate agreements on the behalf of the royalty and kind share, and then we receive the revenue. Ultimately, we reconcile. We pass it on to the nation. They audit us on a quite frequent basis to ensure that we're paying things properly. But yes, they do take that. And one of the issues, or one of the opportunities that the nation has, that we intend to spend some time with the controller and the Budget and Finance Committee to describe, is how hedging could benefit them. Oil prices currently are above $100 a barrel. You can take out financial instruments called hedging contracts to lock in that price. And currently, NOG, we're locked in through the middle of 2023. We know what our oil price is going to be for 80% of our production. So we do that to protect our cash flow stream so that we don't have any negative impacts financially, like the company. That's really the root cause of why the company had its financial constraints back in 2015 and 2016, is the company had elected not to hedge their product. We don't do that anymore. We make sure that we do have some security, and the nation could do the same by protecting, because if you recall back in early 2020, right when COVID happened, oil prices collapsed. And unfortunately, during a period of 6 to 9 months, the Navajo Nation was, because they're not hedged, they saw the market. When the market was $20 a barrel, that's what their royalty in kind was being sold at. NOG, on the other hand, was selling their crude at $60 a barrel because we were hedged. So that's something that the nation could exercise if they wished.
Interesting. Okay. And then we did have a question about the scholarship funds. So each agreement has a scholarship provision. And in your slide, you'd shown some of that. So there's a 10,000 basically minimum during the initial term. Is that a one-time payment, or is that an annual payment?
Yes. I apologize if I tell you the wrong thing, because there's a lot of detail in those agreements. I believe it's an annual thing. What ultimately our intent is that every well has a linkage to a scholarship. So if we create a producing well, we'll pay more in scholarships on an annual basis. And so you do that for each operating agreement. And then our company, it's actually in the Navajo Times today. We also have an initiative outside of these operating agreements where we fund scholarships. Specifically, we just funded $100,000 in scholarships, $50,000 going to NTU and $50,000 to Dene College, that we do at a corporate level. So our goal is to be able to plow back, revenues that the nation, that NOG creates to the nation, whether that's through royalties or through scholarships or through donations at chapter levels. I'm a big fan of having partnerships at the community level where they identify issues, and that could be educational related matters. If we can support, we definitely want to step forward as a good corporate citizen.
And we did have one question. So the scholarship funds are capped per agreement. I understand it at $50,000. And there was a question about tuition, like at NAU, for example. That might be like $30,000 a year.
Right.
Is there any possibility that amount might increase?
Well, it's really tied to each agreement, right? I mean, the way for it to increase is for NOG to be able to access additional agreements. The more agreements we have, the more scholarship monies that could be created. The issue really is around having success, right? I mean, there's only going to be funded royalties. There's only going to be funded scholarships if we have success by selling helium, right? So it's all somewhat intertwined. The more helium we produce, the more revenues we produce, the more I am more than open to talking about increasing scholarship limits. The reason I mentioned the program that we have at our corporate level is that's what we try to do at a kind of somewhat of a larger macro level within the company, that we've got these individual agreements, which goes micro. So at a Sihasin level, and unfortunately, those monies don't flow directly to Sihasin. They flow into the Navajo Nation's General Scholarship Office, but that is specific for that agreement. Let's say, for instance, the Porcupine Dome agreement. If we do 40 of those, there's going to be 40 equivalents of those type of agreements potentially that's going to generate scholarships funds. That's again at a micro level. At a macro level, at a corporate level, we're looking at, okay, here's our profitability. Can we distribute some additional funds through scholarships? So like I said, we just in 2022 just distributed 100,000. So that's really our intent, is that we're creating multiple inputs of revenue stream, whether that's royalties going into the general fund, taxes into the general fund, or scholarship into the scholarship fund.
And then I was curious, there was some language relating to reclamation, but there's not actually a reclamation agreement that is presented along with the operating agreements. Is there any particular reason why there's not a reclamation agreement included?
Good question. I'm not really sure. We weren't guided. I think there's some historical precedent on these agreements with other agreements. That's why there's probably no specific language. This is, I think it's a really, it's an important topic about any operator that comes and works on the Navajo Nation, that they should have, there should be some, value system that the company has with respect to reclamation. The reason I wanted to show you those photos earlier was something that we internally as an organization talked quite a bit about, that we see historical operators that have come onto the nation and have not reclaimed lands like they should have. We're not going to do that. We're going to do things the right way. This is my earth too, as I tell people. I don't like things, it drives me crazy when I see an abandoned site that sits in a location for 20 years. We need to figure out ways to deal with that. And there's no formality in our agreements for that. We've said to the nation and to the minerals department is that we want to help. I mean, we have our operation that we know we can address reclamation on, and there's other sites that are not ours that we could work to remediate as well. There's been a large amount of federal dollars that have been dedicated to the U.S. with respect to some of the agreements. It wasn't in the Build Back Better, but there was some other agreement that Congress passed recently to be able to plug and abandon old sites. We feel like those federal dollars we should be able to access to impact negative blighted sites here on the Navajo Nation that need to be addressed. So I know that probably didn't answer your question, but and maybe something directed to the Department of Justice or the Minerals Department about why it's not explicit. All I can speak to is just kind of how we plan to operate.
Okay, all right. And then I just want to make sure I understand the projects well. So I think the Beautiful Mountain one can have up to 53 well pads and 1 compressor pad. And then Porcupine Dome can have up to 64 well pads. And then the Tisnas Pass Tohatchee Wash site can have up to 83 well pads with 1 compressor. Is that right?
So I guess my question is, where are you getting those numbers? Because those seem way beyond what we would even contemplate. I think that probably what you're hearing is when we started to look at, we wanted to identify if there were locations of that magnitude. We wanted to know what were the homestead and sacred sites that might be antiquities and so forth that might be nearby. I would say that as I was trying to describe earlier, I don't anticipate anywhere near that amount of wells being drilled. That's not to say that we're not going to look at the potential for a number of sites, but ultimately, I don't think, I mean, I have to go back and see exactly the Tohatchee Wash area. I think we're looking at less than 10 wells, for sure, less than 10. Porcupine Dome, probably the same amount. Beautiful Mountains, a little higher potentially because that is an old oil field that did produce helium a number of years ago. So there potentially is maybe as many as 20 sites there. Again, I think that this may be just a disconnect between what we are looking at to assess, because we want to identify what are the locations that are going to have minimal impact. When I say that, I mean with homesteads, with antiquities, sacred sites, and so forth. So we have drawn on a map. Okay, here's the various locations that we potentially could access helium on. Which of these provide impact? And then we get feedback from the Navajo Nation Land Department. They guide us to say, okay, these areas are out, these areas are okay. Ultimately, when it comes to drilling, we want to be able to drill in the most efficient manner as possible, ultimately to ensure that we capture and produce helium, but we don't overspend capital. So in essence, that reservoir, this is where it gets kind of technical here, the polygon for each of those areas, each of those three areas, you've got to visualize that in the subsurface depths of the reservoir. The polygon will not all be helium productive. There'll be certain deposits, and you saw the map that had the three big circles earlier that we would look in the Tohatchee Wash area for drilling. That's where we would focus our activity. And then same thing, the same type of map exists for Porcupine Dome and Beautiful Mountain. So where those numbers, if you don't mind me asking, where did you see those numbers? Was that in the agreement that?
Yeah, that's in the programmatic EAs for the agreements.
Okay, so that's the environmental impact assessment. That again, that is where we're trying to assess the full lands about where environmental impact might be. It does not have a direct linkage to the number of wells that we're going to drill. I'll caution you on that one, because it's what we're trying to do is just ensure that when we do drill, we want to have minimal impact. And if we don't identify where we could drill, the risk is the land department not identifying a risk area for us, and then we go out to try to do activity, and ultimately it'd be rejected through the permit process.
Yeah, the other thing in those descriptions is they describe the size of the well pads. And for Beautiful Mountain, it looks like the well pads can be up to 2.24 acres in size, which is about, it's not quite 2 football fields, but
Right.
The football field is like 1.32 acres.
Right.
And then the well pads for Tisnas Pass / Tohatchee Wash are identified as being possibly up to that same size. And then for Porcupine Dome, they're identified as being potentially, 1.5 acre to 5 acres in size. So yeah, I was going to ask about that in terms of the well pad size for those sites as well, just to get a sense.
Yeah, so the reason that we want to communicate that there's the risk that it could be larger is if we find an area that this kind of gets to the techniques that we might use from a drilling standpoint. In an ideal sense, the most economic manner for us to drill is a vertical well, but there is the potential, if we were to find that the area that we were wanting to explore had let's say a large number of homesteads. What we might want to do is look for a location that has minimal impact on those homesteads and drill what we call deviated holes. If we were to do that, you need a larger footprint at the surface to be able to ultimately move your rig to a location that allows you to drill those deviated wells. So you got to think about this from the surface impact and then what we're trying to target on the subsurface. If let's say, for instance, the vertical well would call for us to put a well in the front yard of a homestead. That's not ideal, right? We'd like to be able to move it far enough away so there's no impact. Thus, you need to have enough of a surface area to be able to ultimately reach the objective. So that's why there is the potential that our development plan, if we found that there was a large surface impact area, we may want to look for an area that allowed us to have a up to a 4 or 5 acre tract to be able to develop all of our wells just on that 5 acres and nowhere else. So this gets to kind of the development strategy. At this point, I'll be perfectly transparent. We don't know the answer yet until we actually get out and kind of go through these phases of exploration through seismic and so forth. At this point, we're somewhat speculating about where we will ultimately drill. We have a good sense of really the first 3 or 4 wells. Once you get beyond that, it gets a bit more complicated because we need to have more data to ultimately decide.
That was a question. I noticed in Tisnas Pass, there's a housing development area that's included in that lease area. And I was curious about, why the housing area wasn't maybe carved out of the proposed area. So
typically what happens is that the operator, in our case, NOG, describes an area they would like to explore, and that's the polygon. And the minerals department, they don't draw any distinction about what's inside of that polygon. They're negotiating with us about, okay, you've got the polygon now. The next step is the permits to do physical work, and that's where the various departments come in, like land, wildlife, fisheries, so on and so forth. They help us identify where there are sites that we have to avoid by a certain distance. So let's say, for instance, a homestead in this case, if we wanted to put a drilling rig near that location, it's got to be a far enough distance, and there has to be compensation for the individuals that we potentially would impact. So it's somewhat of a back and forth between us and the individual being impacted and the land department to ensure there's proper risk mitigation put in place.
We did get a question about whether or not it was expected that there would be an EIS for these projects. You mentioned a little bit about the review process and Department of Interior's role. So I don't know if you're able to address that question. But.
And yeah, I'm sorry, my internet connection seems maybe, did you say an EIS?
Yeah, there was a question on whether you think there might be an EIS for these sites.
Yes.
Is there like some step in the review process where that decision will be made?
Yes, every drilling permit that we obtain, we have to conduct an environmental assessment. And there's got to be, the BLM, the Navajo Nation, Natural Resources Division, and the BIA all have to review that and sign off before we're allowed to move forward. So yes, that will be included in the permitting process.
Okay, because there's the programmatic EA that's attached right now, but if there's identified to be a certain level of potential impact, then that would trigger the more extensive environmental impact statement, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The first assessment tends to be a very high level. As we start to move down from the macro to the micro, where we might drill a location and ultimately file for a drilling permit, that environmental assessment have to be more and more specific to that drilling area and the impact area associated.
I know there recently was regulatory changes that created categorical exclusions. I assume there's not a categorical exclusion here, but and I don't know if you know the answer to that. But
no, I really don't. I mean, I know that there are, like I said, there are sites that are highlighted to us as that we have to avoid. And so when we are looking at potential locations for whether that's seismic or potential locations for drilling or facilities, we've got to consider where those locations are at and move our facility. The good thing in our industry is that that is feasible. I mean, as I mentioned, we do routinely all around the world. We drill deviated wells to ensure that we don't impact whether that's homesteads, whether that's sacred sites, so on and so forth. We've got to do it in a manner that's economic. That's the other part of the equation. You've got to look at the economics, but ultimately the environmental impact is going to be primary. We got to ensure that we don't do something that would be negatively impacting a homestead or a sacred site or so forth.
We did have a question about the profit sharing, is what I'll call it, with the chapters. How often would that funding go to the chapters?
So what we've described, and this is kind of an ongoing discussion we're having with the Department of Justice and potentially, ultimately with the chapters, is how this process would unfold. But what we have promised is that this would be an annual effort, that we would provide details to the chapter about our profitability and what their share means. And ultimately, I mean, this is a donation that NOG's making to that chapter. So we want to be transparent. We want everybody to understand for that particular operating agreement how much profitability is occurring. It is an annual event. We have contemplated maybe taking some risk with this and paying some of that potential benefit up front. I mean, so for instance, with respect to Sihasin, our current model, and again, this is a model, right? So everybody needs to recognize that models are always wrong. So there could be more profitability, there could be less. And we will see in time. We could sell our helium for more, we could sell it for less, we could get more volume than we think, so on and so forth. But our thought is that if it's 1.7 million, if that was the ultimate benefit for the chapter, and that'd be 1.7 million over the life of this opportunity, that could be as long as 10 years. We would then, but we could pay some of that up front. Maybe, our thought is maybe we pay a certain percentage, maybe 10% of the ultimate benefit up front. That's somewhat of a risk on us, but at least, the chapter's feeling some inclusion, some benefit up front, as opposed, and ultimately our bonuses, for instance, go directly to the central government. When we sign these agreements, we feel like maybe the chapter ought to see some of that as well. And that could come out of our pocket.
All right, great. I know there were other questions, and I feel like maybe those were addressed. A lot of those were addressed early on in the presentation. Let me see. And I know we've kept you on a little bit longer than we anticipated. So thank you for being with us for this amount of time and for sharing all that information. The slides were really helpful if folks joined a little bit late. Mr. McClure did do a slide presentation. So I encourage you to sit through that early portion to get that background material. Let's see, and I think we're good to sign off today, but thank you very much for joining.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I love the dialogue, and I really, if there's an opportunity to come back and talk in the future, just reach out and I'll try to make time.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.